So this past year I have been experimenting a lot with painting vehicles. Let's combine those techniques and see if they have legs, like the Sentinel here. I ordered myself an Astra Militarum Sentinel from Element Games. Not sponsored or anything, but I had this in my hand within 18 hours of ordering it, and still cheaper even with the postage than if I'd gone to Warhammer World and bought it at full retail price. Bargain! I love the design of this model, and from what I see, GW have really lent into the modularity of it without the need for magnets, but I will go into that later in more detail while I'm building the thing. I'm also going for a Valhallan theme, as I've been hoarding bits for a while to start a Valhallan Ice Warriors army, but it's all squirreled away in a frankly embarrassingly huge pile of shame. I'm hoping this inspires me to at least starting it. Before we begin, I'd just like to ask you to like and subscribe and hit that bell icon to stay notified whenever we post. We've got some cool stuff coming up in the new year. Right, let us crack forth in an onward direction. I love a scenic base. I did a video on it a couple of months back for grassland foresty bases for my white scars, but this one is getting the snowy treatment because it's Valhallan and it's the only way you're allowed to do it. I'm starting with the base first, as it will be relatively flat and easy to build the actual Sentinel on, but with some dimensionality to make the Sentinel look like it's going off-road. I mean, why build a walker if it isn't going off-road? The main layer is 2 pieces of cork sheet with a small gully between them. The Sentinel will be posed astride this. Next, a few smaller sheets of cork added atop the main 2 to give a little more unevenness. I scatter some scenic ballast around the bases of the rocks. I then dig through my extensive collection of bits to see if there's anything that would make good scatter, and glue that down too, mindful of where the Sentinel's feet will be. It's skulls. Of course it's skulls, it was always going to be skulls. Finally, I slowly drip superglue over the whole base, avoiding the scatter, allowing it to be soaked up by the cork and sealing down all those gravel bits too. This makes the cork much more durable and less likely to flake apart with excess handling, as I myself am prone to do. Flake apart, not damage bases. For the model itself, I shall be starting with the legs and waist. The legs have these tabs so they can be assembled to fit a default pose. If I were to buy more of this kit, and I probably will, I would probably trim the tabs and repose them, but I'm happy with the fixed pose of this specific build. Incidentally, I find the pipe coming out of its bum hilarious. The cockpit goes together nicely, but I leave the roll cage off for access to the pilot. Driver, pilot, dude go brum brum, that sort of thing. One in charge. The only difference between a Scout Sentinel and an Armoured Sentinel is that one has an open cockpit and the other is closed, and with the previous kit you had to commit to one or the other in the build unless you did some serious modifications. This one lets you switch between both, which is great. Like with the cockpit options, the weapons are also interchangeable, being designed to friction fit on their mountings. I love this, and I hope G-dubs are going to fully embrace this with swappable weapons in new kits going forwards. Not everyone has the patience for magnets, and this works just fine. I can see some wear and tear occurring with constantly swapping them out, out, but I still have the magnet option to fall back on should that occur. To be honest, I'd love to be gaming enough where wear and tear on this model becomes an issue. I also chose to change the position of the hunter-killer missile. Rather than mount it on the right side of the Sentinel, I chose to mount it under the cockpit so I could add some more of the optional accessories to the hull. I think it looks better like this and not at all like a winky rocket. With all the weapons and accessories built, it's time to tackle the pilot. I ummed and ahed over which build option to go for, or even whether to cannibalize some Valhallan bits to make him look the part. Yeah, I went with this classic gunner dude, or at least a highly faithful 3D printed one. I think I made the right choice. Don't judge me. The main armour colour is going to be a light grey, so the best place to start for me is a zenithal coat of black followed by a heavy highlight of white. The panels then get a coat of apothecary white contrast paint, and when that is dry I take a piece of sponge and stipple Corax white over the whole piece. This leaves the recesses shaded and also gives some subtle patchiness on the armour plates. I paint the pilot with the same colour palette, and for the skin I use Guilliman Flesh contrast paint. I use snakebite leather on the pouches and Basilicon grey on any fur. I picked out a few cables and other details in white and used some muted colours such as Militarum green and Iandan yellow over them to give a subtle hit of colour. The pouches get a coat of snakebite leather, and the winky rocket, hunter-killer missile, gets Militarum green and Iandan yellow, leaving the cone white. I leave the glass and lenses for now, we'll come back to them later. For metallics, I normally prefer to go bright to dark when I'm going to be using panel liners, but in this case I go for the darker gunmetal metallic from Vallejo. This is not only to make the unpainted metals much darker and worn looking, but to make the later paint chipping effect consistent, as light metallics over light armour don't show up as nicely. The metallics get a gentle sponge highlight of Stormhost silver. I go over the pistons with silver using a brush, as they would be the cleanest parts of the machinery, whilst the cables get the gentlest dry brush of Vallejo bone white. This desaturates them further, tying them into the bleak scene we are making. Transfers are usually left to later in the process, but that often leads to them looking too clear and clean when a model is getting heavy weathering, so doing them now will help integrate them into the finished piece. The Sentinel comes with a transfer sheet with iconography for all the major regiments, so I grab a couple of Valhallan ones and apply them with decal fixer. It can be tempting to go overboard with the number of transfers you put on, so some restraint is required. If you're not sure how much is enough, it often helps to look up images of real-world military vehicles and take some cues from there. One of my favourite things I've started doing this year is giving any silver areas that need to be gold a coat of Guilliman Flesh, namely the piston housings and any decorative elements. This gives a lovely dirty gold look and breaks up the mass of silver nicely. Really nicely. Nicely dirty. Now the Mini is getting an all-over coat of gloss varnish. I am choosing to do it by brush because it's easier than setting up the airbrush. This will protect everything beneath it from the later steps and help the panel liners better run into the recesses. Speaking of panel liners, This has become my favourite part of the whole process. I'm going to use the brown on the armour and weapon casings, and the black on the metallics, but also add in a little brown to the metallics where oil would build up. I also use light grey in certain parts of the armour that won't have gathered that much grime. I often do this without the gloss coat to add stains onto the armour, but that works best with infantry and not vehicles such as this. I slap it on with reckless abandon, making sure to get it in all of the recesses and around all the details such as rivets and lenses. Once the enamels are starting to dry, I come in with a cotton bud to wipe the majority away from the larger panels so that they don't pool. Now that the Sentinel is drying, and best to leave it overnight, I turn to the base and give it an all-over shade with Militarum Green, Snakebite Leather and Basilicanum Grey in patches, wet blending them together where they meet. Once dry, it gets a heavy dry brush of Blue Horror, followed by a lighter dry brush of Dead White. This gives the ground a heavily frosted vibe. I also paint the rim black at this stage. I use Vallejo's Basic Black for this because it is probably the best black acrylic I have ever used. Sorry Abaddon Black. Sorry Chaos Black. Now that the model is dry, it's time to grab the sponge again. First I rough up the surface, ripping little bits out, and then I take dryad bark and stipple it lightly where the most wear and tear will occur. The corners, the edges of the armour, the edges of the doors and hatches, the armour near the ground, and even in the middle of a couple of the larger panels. How extensive you go here is entirely up to you. You can go super grungy or just keep it light and subtle. I'm going for grungy. Once the brown is done, we go back to that gunmetal and stipple it more lightly over the same areas that got the brown. Looks kind of like the paint on my old Renault Clio from 20 years ago. Pigment powders are great for extra weathering. Here I'm using Dark Sienna by Vallejo and a cotton bud to add heavy soot around the engines and exhausts, and where it would naturally stain the armour. Like with the transfers, look up images of vehicles in the same environment and colour scheme to get some ideas if you are stuck. Once the pigments are down, it's a good time to hit it with a coat of matte varnish to seal everything down and get rid of the overall shiny shine. Now the chainsword would have the most damage on it of all the weapons, as it requires physical contact to be effective. No use just waving it at someone, you gotta stick it in there. You can go heavier with the chipping on it, especially near the tip, but I also want it to look like it has been in, let's say, recent use. I take some blood for the blood god and stipple it around the end. I then run it into the recesses of the teeth to be just that little more horrific. Delicious. If you're going to be affixing it permanently to the model, you can extend the splatter effect onto the nearest section of the hull, but it will look a little out of place if you want to keep everything interchangeable. Since there is no point running it without the chainsword, it's getting splatter. Splatter. Corn will be effing cock-a-hoop when he sees this gory boy. I'm going to add some snow to the model. I'm thinking it has been some time since it was under any cover, and so it will have gathered on the surfaces. Of course the heat from the engine would melt it a little after, so when I apply the snow I come in with a wet brush and feather it out. I even paint some of the snow mush around the feet and shins, as it would have been wading through a heap ton of the stuff. Now the model itself is done, it's just time to do the base. I do this with some grass tufts. Here I went with some muted colour ones as they fit the wintry vibe best. Then it is just a case of piling up the snow in the flat surfaces and wet blending it around details. Once the mushy stuff is dry, some additional thick patches are applied. I then give the snow a little sparkle by sprinkling just a few tiny grains of silver glitter over it, so that they give off a twinkling effect. Fun fact about glitter, we queer folk actually produce it from our own bodies. It is usually harvested around December time, because that's what makes the Yuletide gay. Scorch effects are even easier and are super quick. This technique will work on the plasma gun, multi-laser, las cannon, autocannon as well, but here I am using the heavy flamer. The nozzle is already painted gold, but starting with Gilliman flesh gives best results. I then paint the end with Magos purple, and then wet blend Talisar blue into the tip. So here's how to do an easy plasma glow. Paint the coils with white, then cover them in Tesseract glow. It doesn't matter if you hit the edges of the gun casing a little. In fact, it looks like a little light overspill, and it gives you an effortless OSL effect. Finally, I thin down dead white and paint it over the lower half of the coils. This will gather around the bottom where the power source should be and give a lovely gradient glow effect. Easy. Now to just go round and pick out any bits I may have missed and re-establish the black base rim, and we are done. And here is the finished result, using everything I have learned this past year. Well, most of it. I hope you enjoyed it and even got some inspiration for your own projects from it. There are some sexy shots of the finished thing coming up, but before you go, if you could give the video a little like and subscribe, just tickle those little buttons, that would be awesome. I'm Autumn Witch, and I'll catch you next time on Bleeding Tree Gaming.